I'm Elon Musk, and if I'm telling this story honestly, it starts with the strange realization that building rockets and writing code would eventually pull me into the center of political debate. Because when you try to change the infrastructure of civilization, you inevitably collide with the rules, fears, incentives, and power structures that govern it. And the United States space policy is not just about exploration, but about national identity, defense, budgets, and who gets to shape the future. So when I founded SpaceX, my motivation wasn't to pick a fight with Washington, but to solve a physics and economics problem. Namely, how to make access to space radically cheaper so that humanity could become a multi-planet species. Yet, the moment we started landing rockets and winning NASA contracts, the conversation shifted from can this work to should this man have this much influence? And suddenly, my name was being spoken not just in engineering circles, but in hearings, op-eds, and policy briefings, with people asking whether a private company should be responsible for launch capabilities that once belonged solely to governments. And I understood the concern because space has always been intertwined with military power and geopolitical signaling. But I also knew that the old model was unsustainable, that cost-plus contracts and slow iteration were holding us back, and that the best way to strengthen US space leadership was not through bureaucracy alone, but through competition, speed, and engineering rigor. Which is why I pushed hard for reusable rockets even when experts said it was impossible or impractical. And when it worked, the debate evolved again into questions about regulation, oversight, and dependency. Especially as Starlink entered the picture, and suddenly space wasn't just about rockets, but about global communications, resilience in conflict zones, and the blurred line between civilian and strategic assets. And I found myself responding not just to regulators at the FAA or FCC, but to senators and diplomats asking how a private network could influence global events. And my answer has always been that technology itself is neutral, but its availability matters, that providing connectivity can empower people and stabilize systems. Yet I also recognize that this places enormous responsibility on the builders, which is why I've often argued that regulation should be smart and adaptive rather than stifling and reactive, because overregulation can freeze innovation, while under-regulation can create real risks. And the challenge is that politics tends to lag technology. So the debates become emotional and ideological instead of technical, with some critics framing me as an unelected power broker, while supporters frame me as a counterweight to stagnation. And the truth is more nuanced, because I don't wake up thinking about controlling policy. I wake up thinking about failure modes, timelines, and whether we're moving fast enough to avoid existential risks. Yet, I also can't ignore that my companies operate within national frameworks, and that US space policy, export controls, environmental reviews, and spectrum allocation all shape what is possible. Which is why I've been vocal, at times, sometimes too vocal, about the need for reform, about shortening launch approval timelines, modernizing spectrum policy, and recognizing that space is no longer a rarefied domain, but a congested competitive environment where leadership depends on execution. And when people say I'm inserting myself into politics, I see it instead as engineers finally having a seat at the table. Because decisions about orbital debris, lunar governance, and Mars exploration shouldn't be made without input from those actually building the hardware. And at the same time, I accept that public debate is healthy, that skepticism is part of democracy, and that concentration of capability should always be questioned. So, my role, as I see it, is not to replace public institutions, but to challenge them to move faster and think bigger, to demonstrate that ambitious goals are achievable, and to force a recalibration of what the United States expects from its space program. Because if my story has any consistent thread, it's that progress happens when you aim far beyond what seems reasonable and then iterate relentlessly. And if that makes me a controversial figure in the intersection of tech regulation and politics, especially in US space policy, then that controversy is simply a byproduct of trying to bend the curve of history toward a future where space is not a dead end, but an extension of human civilization. If I continue this story, it moves into a phase where I realize that once you demonstrate capability, the expectations multiply faster than the rockets, because suddenly SpaceX wasn't just a contractor, but a pillar of US launch infrastructure. And with that came scrutiny that went beyond engineering into motives, governance, and influence. And I watched the public debate split into extremes, where some people assumed I was acting as an extension of US power, while others accused me of undermining it by insisting on independence. And both missed the core point, which is that resilience comes from redundancy and innovation, not from blocking progress inside a single institution. And this became especially clear as NASA shifted from owning everything to buying services, because that transition forced policymakers to confront a new reality where the government sets goals and standards, but private companies compete to meet them. And I supported that shift not because it benefits me personally, but because it scales ambition, allowing more missions, more experiments, and more rapid learning. Yet every success raised new regulatory questions about safety, environmental impact, labor, and national security. And I found myself frustrated at times by frameworks designed for an era of disposable rockets and slow launch cadence being applied to a world where launches could happen weekly. And I spoke out about it because silence would have meant accepting delays that compound existential risk. And I don't mean that rhetorically, because when you think seriously about asteroid impacts, supervolcanoes, or self-inflicted technological catastrophes, you realize that becoming multiplanetary is not a luxury but a form of insurance. And it's hard to convey that urgency in a political environment optimized for election cycles and risk aversion. So, when people accuse me of pushing too hard or breaking norms, I see it as a mismatch between exponential technology and linear governance, and nowhere is that clearer than in debates about Mars, where some policymakers see it as a distraction while I see it as a necessary horizon goal that drives innovation across propulsion, life support, energy, and materials. And by anchoring US space policy to long-term objectives, you actually strengthen near-term leadership, because talent follows vision, and without vision, you get incrementalism, and incrementalism is how you lose strategic advantage. And this is where tech regulation enters the story more sharply, because as my companies expanded into AI, satellites, and global infrastructure, regulators began to ask whether one individual should have outsized influence across multiple critical systems, and I understand that concern deeply. which is why I've repeatedly said that monopolies are bad and that competition is essential. But competition requires permission to exist, and permission comes from regulatory environments that allow new entrants rather than protecting incumbents. So, my advocacy has always been aimed at lowering barriers while maintaining safety, not at removing oversight. And yet nuance doesn't travel well in public debate, especially online, where complex policy questions are compressed into headlines and moral narratives. And I've sometimes contributed to that chaos myself by speaking too bluntly or too publicly. But the underlying motivation remains consistent, which is to push humanity forward faster than entropy and complacency would otherwise allow. And when I look at US space policy today, I see a system in transition, pulled between legacy structures and emerging realities. And my role within that tension is neither hero nor villain, but catalyst. Someone who forces uncomfortable questions about efficiency, control, and ambition. And if history judges me harshly or kindly, will matter less than whether the trajectory bends upward. Because in the end, this story isn't really about me at all. It's about whether we chose to expand the frontier when we had the chance, or retreated into fear and paperwork while the future waited just beyond the atmosphere. Because once your work intersects with geopolitics, crises, and public trust, every decision is interpreted through a political lens, and I learned that there is no such thing as a purely technical choice anymore, especially when space systems are used in real time by governments, military, scientists, and civilians. And suddenly a constellation of satellites is no longer just an engineering marvel, but a subject of congressional letters, international law discussions, and late-night cable news arguments. And I found myself in the uncomfortable position of being asked to make calls that traditionally belonged to nation-states. Not because I wanted that authority, but because technology moved faster than policy had prepared for. And this is where the public debate around my role intensified, with critics arguing that no private individual should have that much leverage over infrastructure that affects national security, while others argued that without rapid private sector action, the United States would fall behind competitors who don't share the same openness or restraint.